So measures you need, I have 12 here, less than 14, I don't know why. Nape to waist, length, neck circumference, shoulder width, shoulder angle, side depth, armhole width, hip measure, chest measure, waist measure, front balance, back balance. I think the other two were probably for the sleeve length and something else.
So that'd be 13 and 14 would be... Because you said up to 15, but...
I think max up to 15. Because you know, for the sleeve, all you need is the length. The rest you derive from the armhole. So what's the... whatever, even better. So 13, let's say, including the sleeve. But for now, we're only concerned with the body. So here's what I thought. Let's move away from the point-to-point system and then introduce the draft as sets. You know, so what I've done is every step is in a particular color, and then when you move to the next step, everything that's from the previous step becomes gray, is just grayed out. And then you get the next step in color. And then you continue that. Every section has its own thing, and then you can focus on one thing at a time and do whatever explanation needs to be explained for that particular thing. Now, this is fairly simple. So it lacks a little bit of detail, but I just talk you guys through it, and then once you get going, we'll do something about it and then develop this further. So here's the thing. First, we need to have this main frame. And the main frame is basically the widest circumference, which doesn't matter whether you draw it on this line, or this line. It's just the widest circumference, the distance between the center back and the center front. So we say the first one is the nape line. Let's call it that. Nape line, widest circumference. Then you have B, which is just your square down center back. Then you have your nape to waist, and on that line, again, widest circumference. And then you have your length, and then again, widest circumference, then you get the center front. Simple frame. Then we have back neck, back shoulder, and then we have chest line, because then once we have the back shoulder, we can use our back balance measure to get to where the point where the chest line is on, and then we go across, and then we have the front neck and the front shoulder. That's that. Then once we have that, then what we have to do is cross back, back side, cross chest, front side, side depth, obviously, and that's pretty much it. That's the armhole, done. And then once you have that, then you get the position of the side seams and the underarm seam, which have a fixed place, and then they get altered based on the suppression that we identify the location of. And then once you have the side seams, you get the darts, whichever. You can exclude this or you can exclude this. The darts are optional depending on what figure you're going to go for. We can expand on this later on. And then once you've got the darts in, then you fine-tune the shapes by removing the negative space, and poof, your pattern is done. So I'm trying to say something, I'm trying to think how to formulate it. I would like to believe, although that's not the case, but I would like to believe that if we manage to do this well, what we could do is up to every explanation that we provide up to this point of the draft actually happening, hopefully once they get to the draft, they wouldn't need much more than this as instruction, because I could tell you, if I could tell you, go from this point to that point, from this point to that point, from this point to all these fucking points. Or I could just say, make a frame using the widest circumference, and then making sure that you have your nape line, waistline, and the hemline. And then the widest circumference has on one side the center back, and on one side the center front. That's simpler, not to the point that one would get it if they don't know all these things, but it's simpler than to say, go from this point to that point, then from this one to that one, then from this, too many points. So I try to find a way to remove all those points, but then explain them in sets.
Yeah.
And they could use the visuals as well of the instruction. So once you have the pattern, which you go through fairly easily if you have understood this, because it's literally what we're doing there, plus the negative space removal, nothing else. Well, if you've understood this, then you can fairly easily go through the draft, and then once you've got the draft, then another important part kicks in, which is truing the pattern, which essentially is making sure that all your runs and all your seams are in harmony and have the same lengths where they need to have the same length. So then that requires its own procedure. So then you start with cutting out the side body net on both sides. I mean, seams included, but net without extra paper around it. And then you use the side body runs to make the underarm seam on the forepart the same in terms of a run. And you do that for the same for the back, making sure that the back has the same run. And then after that, you make sure your hem has the same line, like a smooth run. Connect your armhole, connect your necklines, do all of that, which is a very important part, all of this, of pattern cutting in general. And then this is a duplicate, you can ignore that. So then once you finished, you have your pattern. And then hopefully that's going to be a pattern that only requires one fitting.
And through this process of the last part you just explained, you'll go a bit more in depth.
Yeah. I mean, look,
Then you've done
sure. This is, I mean, like I said, as you saw with the draft, that's the general idea of it.
Yeah.
There will be some additional detail, but I'd like to keep it as minimum as possible without leaving details behind so that it becomes impractical.
It will be interesting for you to go through it, because as much as I understand your kind of hesitation to put points in, I think using maybe under 5 points if you could.
Okay.
Just because I think a lot, especially students, will say, oh wait, where am I going from? And if it's just going from one line to another line, there might be ways of distorting that.
I feel like Kim wants to say something as well.
I was of the same mindset, I think having the square and then the initial box, like the milk carton image, didn't have the waistline, so you have to then go to the suppression line and make sure you've understood everything before you get to the square as a new student.
Yeah.
I don't know if it would be simple enough for them to understand. I suppose you've got the letters, you've got the names, but then I've obviously got that traditional mindset where I've done quite a few drafting systems now, from A to B, B to C, C to D, where I know what I'm doing, kind of thing. Whereas I don't know if a new person would.
Yeah.
And it's also, you have to think of them coming from, this will probably not be the first pattern draft they've read.
Yeah.
So they'll be used to having 1,000 points. So going from 1,000 points to nothing
points,
might be actually something to overcome. Versus going from 1,000 points to 4 or 5 basic points, which are much easier to follow and read on the page.
I think everyone gets the Winifred Aldridge book as their first pattern cutting book because it's cheap and it's
has many.
basic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess the question is, where do you start then? If you don't have the points, going from this to that point.
Yeah, I guess
the question is, where do we start?
Yeah, you just need
what's the next step then?
just a few just to say, okay, this is the nape.
Yeah.
So square up across, and that's your nape. That intersection is your center back and your nape.
Yeah. Okay.
Out of curiosity, and this could be different for the draft. Your nape goes out.
Yeah.
And then you have the back neck, which is higher. And then you go down for your chest line from your back balance measure. Does the front balance on the draft always hit the nape line?
It should be variable.
No.
Right?
Because it changes. So this is just for this example. But if you have your front and back balance, right, if you have those measures, you use the back balance as soon as you have your back shoulder.
No, absolutely.
So then you get your chest line based on the measure you have from your center to your back balance. Then you go across, and then you apply your front balance measure, and that gives you wherever your neck point has to be.
So this is just like a small point. I think that especially students will look at
The
illustrations and say, why is my neck point not hitting that line?
Great point.
So actually making it not hit it and say it might hit it, it may not.
Maybe then this whole thing shouldn't go all the way across. It should maybe stop somewhere there.
Something like, because
Yeah.
then you're not thinking, oh, if it doesn't hit, I've done something incorrectly.
Great point. Okay, so what could be interpreted literally when it shouldn't be interpreted literally, and remove that
Yeah.
completely?
Because ultimately a lot of students will think,
Yeah.
I just need to get something that looks like what I'm seeing.
Yes,
It's not what I'm seeing, and there's something
Yeah.
wrong.
100% correct. That's a very good point. Cool. So that's basically how it goes. And then once the truing is done, then pretty much the pattern is done. And then, here is something else. And I think I've put this more in the fitting part, because I think I don't know, we can talk about this. We thought it's better to know this, what I'm about to show, once you've made the pattern, and then during fittings, because during the fittings you may want to make changes, to know exactly those rules instead of knowing them when you're drafting, because you don't really need to know them because the system already demands you to have your underarm seam and side seam in a particular place. So here's the thing. I'm literally going to read this. Technically, there is only one correct position for every seam, purely techniques speaking. Covering of a shape with something else that you put the shape in, so that's the pattern. Seams are not just lines, they are lines with a particular shape and angle. When these are joined together, volume is created. It's crucial to give volume to the pattern where volume is on the object. Okay, so if you have boobs here and your pattern has boobs here, that's not going to fit, right? So if a seam provides shape, but that seam is not on the shape of the object, a misfit will occur. So it's important to know that, because people, and I used to think like this, people tend to think, well, if you can display seams, then it means that you could put seams anywhere dependent on the design that you're trying to create. Yeah, you can do that if the seam doesn't have volume built into it. Because as soon as it does have volume built into it, that volume has to sit on the volume that the shell is kind of like accounting for. So an instruction of where the technically correct positions of the seams should be. I'll ignore this one except for the fact that, pit of the neck for the center front, straight down through the belly button. Simple, for like a shirt-ish front. Here is something else. For the shoulder, the neck points have to fall in the middle of the neck, of the width of the neck. And the shoulder points have to fall right on the bone here, which essentially, if you connect a line, gives you exactly the middle of the shoulder. So if you have center back seams that fall here, technically, they are in the wrong place. The majority shape of the shoulder is forward in the middle of the width of the neck. Movement is another layer that plays a role in where a seam should be. So that's one thing. The underarm seam, the main role of this underarm seam is to provide shape for the side. If you don't have any shape on the side, you don't really need an underarm seam. But if you do have an underarm seam, it should fall right in the middle of the waist from the side looking, right? So if I would have the chest here, which is slightly further back, and my underarm seam would fall there, it means that if I would draw and continue my line down there, my underarm seam would be too far to the back, which doesn't fall into where the actual shape is going to be.
Is this different than what we did with Kimberley? Because I thought you were doing the underarm seam at the halfway point of the side.
Yeah, I've made a change to that. Yeah, I'm sorry, I had to say that. Yeah, I've made a change to that. It was too far back. My initial thinking was it's easier to use the armhole as a reference and go for there. But then I noticed that if someone is standing like that, then someone I know stands like that, then what you actually get is their waistline and their side panel of the waist is going to be more forward. So then the armhole is so far back that you actually tend to miss that shape. So it's better to use the waist as the anchor point for, not the anchor point, that's the wrong word. To use the waist as
As a reference?
a reference point for the position of the underarm seam. The middle of the waist panel, side panel. Jesus Christ.
So how does that translate to, because what we're looking at is a cross section of a three-dimensional body. When we have this here,
Yes.
what are you actually, where are you finding that halfway point?
So you know the diagram we said on your previous page?
Yeah.
If you have that, you can tick the boxes.
Yeah.
So then what you have to do is you have to look at the person, identify their armhole, like where would the circle be that goes around your arm, and then say, where is the waist? Is it more forward than the armhole or further back? And if I would draw a straight line from the middle of the armhole down, how far forward would this fall? And then when you get to the draft, when you get to the draft here, and for example, the waist was more forward than the armhole and your underarm seam falls here, then you know you're not doing it right. Because it's not in the middle of your armhole, it was more forward. You know what I mean?
Would you always want that line to be at a right angle? Like
This one.
straight up and down, yeah.
It as the basic identifier of the position, yes. But if as soon as you introduce
shape.
suppression, then it's
Yeah.
not going to be a straight line
Yeah.
anymore.
But then, say for me, because I've got a lot on my front, would the line be angled forwards?
No,
Yeah.
it'd be pushed forward though, wouldn't it?
Forward, yeah.
You are. I can do this. The best way I could do this is this. You are this one. You know what I mean? Now here's the thing. The reason why it's added to the front and not to the side panel per se is that if this line falls in the middle of your waist and it's your hip that is pushing everything forward, then it has to be added to the front, not to the side. But if it's the case that you're so extremely forward that everything has to move forward, then it may be a little bit more forward, yeah. Matthew is looking perplexed.
So, yeah, but I'm just going back to where you're actually, when you're drafting, on the draft, where that goes. Is it just the halfway point of the waist?
Yes, but you have to relate it to something, because on the draft it's not obvious
You
where
don't
the half
have a
is, so
waist.
you relate it to the armhole. I don't know if this is very visible, but suppose you're looking at the person, you have to, Cyclops from X-Men, the laser beam, you put your laser beam on and you look through the arm of the person and you look at the armhole, then you ask yourself the question, I mean look at this line is already like right dodgy, but suppose you say, if I would draw a line straight down, would that fall on the middle of the waist from the side view?
Got it.
Then we get the side body, and so again, the underarm seam is in the middle of the waist. The top of the side seam is, if you would look at the armhole, it would be halfway the armhole. So you move pretty much the radius from the circle up, and that's where the top of the side seam should be. And obviously the width at the top is the width of the armhole, but once you've done your pattern and you've drafted it and you're truing it, you can double check to see if that matches the measure. But you can start by assuming that this is the width of the armhole as a good starting point. Then once you have this point, the bottom of the side body side seam is going to be between the center back and the underarm seam. So relating that back to the pattern here, so sorry for my sloppy illustration. This should be slightly higher, which brings this point here. So once you have this point, the middle of the armhole, or the middle of the side depth, you connect that point, the bottom point, to the center, between the center back and the underarm seam, and that gives you the right position of the side body, which was the weird back shape that we looked at and we were like, what the fuck is this? So that's that. Any question? I feel like there's a question.
So if your box
Mhm.
that you've created,
Yeah.
like we did on me, was like 44 inches. It was a 44-inch wide box. And then the armhole you've decided in the middle. But then how do you know if you've taken like a really big measurement that Q will fall halfway between P and the centre back
Mm-hmm.
if your measurements aren't?
Oh yeah. So here's the thing. Like I said, we're not measuring like that
Right,
anymore because that
okay.
would be too vague.
Yeah.
So what we are measuring now is what we measure the actual body.
Yeah.
We include the ease,
Yeah.
but then we reduce from where it should be reduced
Okay.
and leave the widest circumference at the chest line where it should be, or at the bottom where it should be. So it could be that you remove from here, but if this is the widest circumference, you end up removing from here.
Right.
But you start off with the widest circumference as the entire width of your block.
But then, say for me, who's wonky, and the circumference of my bust and my hips were more or less the same, but because would my grid still be a rectangle, or am I going to squish out?
You just shift the bottom of or the top
Right.
relative to the other. So there were two phases, right? One is the position
Yeah.
difference, and one is the hollowness difference. And so the position difference, that's the point where you can reduce where reduction is needed, or you offset where offsetting is needed.
Is it not basically that this is more forward than, and so this point would be with Kimberly more forward, and this point would be a bit more back?
Yeah, so Kimberly's question is what do you do if you're not per se reducing, but you have the lower and the upper part of the body the same measure.
Yeah.
And then what you have to do is look at where the negative space is and just offset them so that it matches the negative space.
How do you do that in the square? So for my square that I'm the same here and here, how do I then offset? How would a student or whoever offset it if this is like the same and I've got no negative space to take away because the measurements are the same, but I need to offset them?
Well, you still have negative space.
Right.
Your negative space is is that your hip is more forward. So the negative space is at the back. So you reduce from the back.
But I don't have extra on my block, on my grid. I don't have.
Oh,
extra.
you can get out of the line.
Right.
So you
okay,
can get
so
out of the
it's
box.
like
No.
That's it.
You in that case you have to because there's no way around it.
Yeah.
Unless you do the complicated way, which was what I did.
Yeah.
You just take a very big measure.
Yeah.
We can go through that actually and see in the final analysis which one is the better. Because maybe we say not taking a too big of a measure is simpler to do A, B, and C. But if you take the bigger measure, you may struggle with A, B, and C, but then have to do D, E, and F a lot easier.
Right.
So we have to weigh that out. But in essence, there are solutions for both. And I tend to have both solutions, but we have to play around with that.
Yeah.
I feel
I
like
think-
Matthew
no,
has
no.
something to say.
No, I think as long as that is then specified in the beginning of the draft,
Yeah.
because if we're saying draw this box, everyone's going to think I have to stay within this box.
True. Yeah. Another point. I'm actually going to write this down. Now that we talked about this, does it make sense that how the side body side seam is produced position-wise? All right,
Yeah.
cool. So then that's that. And what that does is it makes the side seam fall exactly on this line. And so this is where the actual hollowness is. If you go any further, you have your underarm seam accommodating for that. So really, you don't want your back to travel all the way from here, because it will fall into the danger zone of having the tension and not being stretched out. And usually you don't stretch out side seams. If you don't have to, if they are in the right place, unless you have like a ton of inlay. So then we have that. Back neck on the nape bone. The shoulder point, technically speaking, has to be as far as the farthest point on the deltoid, unless you have such narrow shoulders and such wide arms that you would have to make the shoulders like 10 inches. Then in that case, you can make the shoulders slightly narrower, but then what you have to do is to make sure you have a lot bigger top sleeve for it to actually cover that, and perhaps cut the pad slightly wider once the jacket is finished, so it still extends the shoulder without collapsing, because otherwise you get like a dip in there. And that's it. That's literally it. And then another concept that I'm working on, this you can see is infant. So 3 analytical lenses of tailoring, and this comes back to at every stage you're looking at the body in a different way. At what stage? At one stage we were looking at it in blocks. So that's actually this yeah. So the other part, when we get, and this is linked to the previous book, is when you're looking at the grid and the pattern as a grid and it moving in space in a grid, and then you have the silhouette, which you just look at the body as a silhouette, nothing more. And I think it's good to put in each section how you should look at the body, so that you don't try to view the body as a block when you're supposed to look at it, for example, as the negative space of a curvy silhouette or whatsoever. And that's that.
All right.
Cool.
That's that.
What I'd say is the draft aspect, everything made a lot of sense. The draft aspect still seemed to rely largely on just visually looking at the lines.
Yes, I haven't, to be honest, I haven't worked it out in terms of articulation, in terms of typing the instructions. But what I'll do is we'll go through that. As we make one here, one of you guys drafts it. I'll just go through each section, and then before I send this file to you guys, with the feedback that we get now, I'll put in exactly what is needed for that.
Yeah.
And then I'll send the file to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could work on the wording today of exactly what.
Yeah, I think so too. I think
Yeah.
so. So the question is, do you think, because for me it doesn't matter, do you prefer to work on the wording before we do the draft or as we are doing the draft?
That's what we do.
I say as, because then we'll be fine tuning in real time.